Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Sandro Galea, and I have the privilege of serving as Dean of the Boston University School of Public Health. On behalf of our school, welcome. Before we begin, a word of thanks to everybody who helped make today happen. First of all, thank you to everybody in the audience. This is the beginning of our public health conversation series for the semester, and it's wonderful to have you join us. Thank you to our Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Justice for co-hosting this event. Thank you to Meredith Brown and Alicia Noel, who coordinate these events. And thank you to our school's ICPH core instructors and our DEIJ committee who selected our annual SPH Reads book, which this is one of. Thank you to our Office of Graduate Student Life for ensuring that everybody in our community could read this book, which is going to inform a full semester of conversations at our school. The past year and a half have been many things. They have been a public health crisis, a political sea change, and a global reckoning with our shared vulnerability to disease. The past year and a half have also been fundamentally a conversation about health. This conversation has unfolded at the local, national, and global levels. Here at our school, we have engaged with this dialogue through a series of public health conversations. At these events, we have been joined by experts who guide our discussion on the issues that matter most to health. The goal of these conversations is to inform an exchange of ideas that supports a healthier world. These events are always free and open to the public, and are posted on our website afterwards. We are glad you are here, and we invite you to join us for our upcoming programming. Today's event is our first public health conversation of the academic year, as I mentioned earlier. It is also part of our school-wide program, SPH Reads, in which our community reads one book and comes together over the course of the semester to discuss it. We are truly delighted this year to be joined by the author, Catherine Coleman Flowers, to discuss her book, Waste: One Woman's Fight Against America's Dirty Secret. And here to introduce Catherine Flowers is our event moderator, Dean Yvette Cozier, our Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity and Inclusion and Justice at the school. Dean Cozier.
Thank you, Dean Galea, and good afternoon. Catherine Coleman Flowers is an internationally recognized environmental activist, MacArthur Genius Grant recipient, and author. She has dedicated her life's work to advocating for environmental justice, primarily equal access to clean water and functional sanitation for communities across the United States. She is also founder of the Center for Rural Enterprise and Environmental Justice. I know that I speak for our community today when I say I look forward to hearing from her. We are also glad to be joined by today's moderator, Barbara Moran. For more than 20 years, she has worked as a science journalist covering issues of public health, environmental justice, and the intersection of science and society. She has written for many publications, including the New York Times, New Scientist, Technology Review, and the Boston Globe magazine, and produced television documentaries for PBS and others. She now runs WBUR's three-person environmental team, which covers stories about energy, ecology, and environmental justice. I will now turn the event over to her. Welcome, Barbara, and welcome, Ms. Coleman Flowers.
Thank you, Dean Cozier. As mentioned, we're delighted to introduce author Catherine Coleman Flowers. In her book, Waste: One Woman's Fight Against America's Dirty Secret, Flowers shares her inspiring story of advocacy from childhood to environmental justice champion. She discusses sanitation and its correlation with systemic class, racial, and geographic prejudice that affects people across the United States. Ms. Flowers, we are looking forward to hearing your remarks and talking to you afterward.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for this opportunity to be here today. And I generally write notes when I speak because I come from a place of wanting to have more of a conversation than a keynote address. But I like to give you some information about my background that will inform why I wrote the book, as well as what I'm doing currently. I am a native of Lowndes County, Alabama. I currently live in Montgomery, which is between Selma and Montgomery in Alabama. This area is very, very rich and steeped in history. And as we look at the history of this area, we cannot separate it from health. I actually, as my background as a historian, a former history teacher, I think it's very important that we need to go back when we haven't done so and look at health and history and how it has had an impact on growth and development throughout the world. In Lowndes County, Alabama, a lot of people that end up settling the area and living in the area did not come there by choice. Montgomery, Alabama became one of the principal places involved in the slave trade when the Constitution ended the importation of slaves from Africa. So there were domestic markets, and Montgomery was one of those. And when people were brought in, whether it was by way of the railroad or by way of the Alabama River, they were marched down Commerce Street to different places that were, and at that time, some were slaveholding pens, one of which is an organization that I love dearly and I'm affiliated with as the Rural Development Manager of the Equal Justice Initiative. It was a slaveholding pen. And in terms of people understanding the history of the area and how it impacts where we are now in the US, I would like to do a shameless pitch and ask everyone, when it is safe to do so, to visit Montgomery and visit the National Memorial to Peace and Justice, as well as the museum, because I think it has a lot of information there that will inform our history, and it also help us to understand public health and how public health sometimes has had a negative impact because of the policies and decisions that have been made. In terms of Lowndes County and its history, there were lots of there were a lot of people there that descended from slaves, including myself. Lowndes County's history is also significant to Native American or indigenous history because one of the battles of the Creek Wars was fought in Lowndes County. And President Andrew Jackson informed a lot of his policy, especially the infamous Indian removal policy, came about as a result of his experience when he was sent down to Alabama to put down rebellions where indigenous people were concerned about their property being encroached upon by white settlers. And once he put down the battle, one of those battles again that was fought in Lowndes County, the Battle of Holy Ground, which led to people being moved out west to places like Oklahoma. And that again, I think is a very powerful, sets a framework for our history and where we are today. Fast forwarding Lowndes County in the 1960s, a lot of people didn't know about Lowndes County's history in terms of movement prior to that time. W.E.B. Du Bois spent some time in Lowndes County and wrote about how bad the labor system was because slavery was reverted from free labor to a sharecropper system that was almost next to free labor. And again, when I look at the factories here and the issues that they have around public health, a lot of that is informed by that same history. In the 1960s in Lowndes County, they organized the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, which became the original Black Panther Party. And I remember there was a person who lived in Boston, who was very involved in the film, the documentary Eyes on the Prize. And Eyes on the Prize captures some of the role that Lowndes County played in that movement, where it organized the original Lowndes County Freedom Organization. And the Lowndes County Freedom Organization was the original Black Panther Party. It did not start in Oakland, it actually started in Lowndes County. But a lot of people, students from all over the country came to Lowndes County as part of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. So out of all of that comes my history and how I came to this place where I am today because of the legacy of so many other people that went before me. I would be remiss to not mention that in terms of health, I remember what motivated me to activism. It was, I think at that particular time, it had to be, it was in the 70s when my parents were visited by a crew from BBC to interview my mother. And they were interviewing my mother because they had discovered that a lot of women in the Black Belt had been sterilized without their permission. And my mother was one of those women. And she had worked to organize and to encourage women that did not want to speak out about it to speak up so that the change could be made in the policy that would not allow this to ever happen again. And that was my first opportunity to kind of see the connections between policy, health, and social justice. Then, of course, later, I just remember growing up where we lived so close in some cases to where crops were raised, especially cotton. And there would be these crop dusters would fly over our homes and spray DDT over the community. And the reason I knew as a child that it was poisonous, that something was wrong with it, because it would kill just about everything that was small in the area. And we could see dead snakes in the road or frogs or whatever, or birds, because of this spraying of the DDT, which later was outlawed and banned. But because it was a community of color, these things that impacted our health just did not matter. And that was one example, and one of my other early examples of environmental justice issues and how it manifests in communities of color or communities that are poor. And moving on from there, I later started to see how a lot of what we have thought was normal, like, in my community, so many people had diabetes that we called it sugar diabetes. And we thought that it was natural, that everybody would have, that everybody would have high blood pressure. So a lot of the illnesses that we grew up thinking were normal, and that was just a part of life, were actually in part because of poor policy and things that were put in place, structural racism that created the health disparities that we're dealing with today, and is being played out across the country through COVID and how it impacts communities that have been left behind. So I think that the failure of our failure to deal with these systemic issues that exist throughout communities is one of the reasons why we're at the place where we are today. What brings, I guess, me to your attention in addition to the book is the fact that we did a parasite study when I went back home to Lowndes County to work, and I found that a lot of people were sick. People that were my age looked a whole lot older. And then when they were telling me about the health issues they were having, it just didn't make a lot of sense to me. And I wasn't sure what was causing it, not sure we still know what's causing it. However, one of the concerns was sewage being on the ground. And when I went back home and saw, and I thought it was normal because I grew up seeing sewage on the ground. I grew up without houses. I grew up not having indoor plumbing. But going back years later to see that those same conditions still existed was a shock even to me. But listening to people in the community talk about these problems and what I was seeing firsthand made me wonder and question whether or not there was a health component to this, because I just remember something so basic as the reason when we go to the bathroom, we wash our hands to keep from contaminating ourselves. So with people living around this all the time, I started to wonder whether or not there could be a health component. And as people started sharing with me the different issues they were having, it all came together when I read about a health advocate named Dr. Peter Hotez. And I was able to apply my own situation where I was called to a site where a person who was being cited, was about to be arrested again for not having a wastewater system. She was 26 years old and pregnant. She had one child who was autistic and of course was with child. And they wanted to put her in jail because she couldn't afford the system. Her income was very meager, and there's nowhere in the world she could have paid for an on-site system. And just outside of her home, her mobile home, there was she was straight piping. And straight piping means that there was a pipe going outside of the house with the sewage going on top of the ground. In her case, it was going into a pit. And that particular October, there were lots of mosquitoes that were teeming around this pit of raw sewage. And I was bitten by mosquitoes, broke out in a rash, went to my doctor, wanted to know whether or not there was something wrong. And she said my test results, my blood test came back negative, although I had a rash all over my body and I didn't know what was the cause of it. And it was later when I read the op-ed in the New York Times that was written by Dr. Peter Hotez, who was the dean of the National School of Tropical Medicine at Baylor. And I Googled him and wrote him about my experience, only to find out, and my question was, is it possible that there's something that we could have in Lowndes County that American doctors are not trained to look for? And it was through that process I started my journey learning about hookworm, because he said we're going to look for hookworm. And I started reading about hookworm. And one of the things that I found out is that the Rockefeller Sanitary Commission was set up for the purpose of trying to eliminate hookworm. And even with that process, I went back and I looked at history to see what happened in the communities of color, what happened in my community. At one point, Lowndes County, excuse me, not Lowndes County, but the Gulf Coast of Alabama was kind of like the center of the hookworm infestation here in this state. And I wondered, as they went around and started treating people for hookworm, what happened in Black communities? So in order to find out, I found a medical association. There was a medical association that was predominantly Black, made of Black doctors. And the person who was the president of the medical association was at Tuskegee, which is not very far from Lowndes County. And when I read, I went and found his papers and was able to figure out that he was hired by the Sanitary Commission to do a survey of the Black community to see whether or not they found hookworm, because there was a rumor that was going around at that time. It sounds like COVID. They're saying that I've heard some rumors that Black people, the ones that we were spreading COVID. Another rumor said that there were other rumors that were going around as well about COVID that's very similar to what they were doing with hookworm. With hookworm, they were saying that Black people were resistant because we were from Africa, so we were resistant to hookworm. And but this doctor sent out a survey to Black doctors, asking them whether or not any of them had treated patients for hookworm. And only of all the surveys that he sent out, only a few came back. And what was really interesting to me is that very few of them had treated anyone with hookworm. Then I thought, so we were talking about the early part of the 1900s. How many Black doctors were in places like Lowndes County, Alabama? How many were in rural communities? Most of them, chances are, were in urban areas. And therefore, there would have been sanitation there, and not the type of sanitation that still exists in Lowndes County today, and could have skewed the findings. But based on that, there was some public policy that was made that where the focus was not on Black communities at the time. A lot of the focus were on poor white communities and making sure that people had access to health privilege. And out of that grew the public health movement in the South, because prior to that time, there was no real organized public health movement in the South. And fast forwarding to today, when we started working on this particular issue, what we found is that the health department, the state health department, was very involved in a sanitation issue, but not from the perspective of listening to people in the community to see whether or not the systems that they had mandated work, first of all, and second, whether or not they were affordable and who would really have them. And when we even went back to ask them about, in Lowndes County in particular, we wanted to know whether or not these on-sites, who had on-site systems and who didn't. They didn't have their paperwork was not organized for them to tell us that. So one of the things that we found with a big public health issue like this, we have to work together to figure out, first of all, where else in the United States are people living without wastewater treatment? People that are straight piping, where else? It's not just in Alabama. Actually, the state health director at that time, when I was doing this work initially, said that it was in all 67 counties in the state of Alabama. where people were straight piping. Now we know that they not only are straight piping, but they have failed systems as well. Where else in the US are people dealing with failed systems? And in my book, I try to write about that. And I visited some of those areas, and we'll be visiting more of those areas in the future. And I'm hearing from people around the globe that are having the same issues, that where they have, and we have discovered since that time that it's not just on-site systems that are non-existent. There are also many failing systems. And that's where we come to the intersection of climate change and climate justice, is that a lot of our technologies that were built to protect the public health are no longer working. And what I cannot understand is that in this day and time that we still have on the books here in Alabama, the ability to arrest people or incarcerate people who cannot afford on-site septic systems or have working septic systems, and that keeps it in the shadows. However, people can spread COVID, don't have to get vaccinated, and feel that it's their right to do so. This is something that shows part of the inequities that exist as it relates to public health. And the whole purpose of public health is to protect the common good. And we have to look at it differently and come from a more humane way to address these problems. I wanted to also deal a little bit with climate and how climate change should be looked at through the lens of public health. Because a lot of the work that I'm going to be doing going forward, not only dealing with just the wastewater problem, because I think climate change actually makes it worse. We're going to start seeing illnesses or diseases that generally, or parasites existing that generally don't exist this far north, because we're warming. We're warming to the point that I saw in the headlines today that this year is the hottest year on record. And if that continues, we're not prepared for, and we can see this with COVID, the strain that is causing on our health system, our healthcare system. We're not prepared for what we will be dealing with, not in the future, but what we're going to be dealing with this year, next year, and down the road. So I think it's very, very, that we have to look at all the consequences of the choices that we've made, the public health consequences of not doing anything. And waste is just one way of looking at that. But through it all, we can see how it's impacting people around the country and around the world. Recently, I visited Mount Vernon, New York. And I wrote an op-ed piece about that visit because I was so moved by it. Mount Vernon, New York is located about 20 minutes from Times Square. It is in one of the wealthiest counties in the country, and certainly the wealthiest county in New York and Westchester County. I was invited there by the mayor because she was trying to figure out a way to deal with the infrastructure issue that's there right now. And they have 100-year-old clay pipes that are at least 100 feet underground that are crumbling. And what it's doing is causing sewage to come back into people's homes. I met an engineer who lives there who is very, very upset because he has children at home and he's concerned about what kind of illnesses could be manifesting in his home and his family because of the sewage that's constantly coming back into their home. Then you add the layer of climate change. You know, when Hurricane Ida was still out in the Gulf of Mexico, I'm about 3 hours from the Gulf, about 200 or so miles inland from Mobile Bay. And every time there's a hurricane in the Gulf, especially if we're on the east side of it, I'm very concerned because we're impacted by that. And we know when it comes ashore, it can bring winds and it can also bring rains. And when it brings rains and you have sewage on the ground, especially if there are floods, it doesn't stay in the backyard where it's going, it ends up contaminating the entire community. And I was very concerned about that. And I was concerned about communities here in Montgomery, which I will come back to in a minute, but I was certainly concerned about places that have been flooding a lot. And what I didn't know, that Hurricane Ida would ultimately impact Mount Vernon as well because of all the rains that it brought to the Northeast. in Mount Vernon, because of climate change, they're getting more and more floods. As they get more and more floods, there's more and more failures of their wastewater treatment. And we need to understand the impact that it could have on the health of people that are living in those conditions. And these are not, and the interesting thing about Mount Vernon is that most of the people there are not poor. These are homes that, compared to homes in Alabama, are homes that the more affluent would be expected to live in, but it's relative to the location. But at the same time, one of the things that I've seen in a lot of these EJ communities, they tend to be people of color. They tend to be people of color, or they come from marginalized communities, other marginalized communities. And in that particular case, we see that in Mount Vernon. And I was told that after the remnants of Hurricane Ida hit that area, is that some of these people that were used to having, 2 and 3 feet of water in their basement with sewage, this time had 6 feet of water in their basement with sewage. And it's a continuing problem. And the question is, what is happening with the health of people that are living there? Here in Montgomery, Alabama, which is the capital of the state, actually, it was the first capital of the Confederacy. We just recently found out that there are communities here that do not have wastewater treatment that's connected to the decentralized system. That there was a deliberate decision that was made that when they built the wastewater treatment system here in this city, to exclude Black communities, and they would be on failing septic systems. The systems are failing. The systems are failing because the water tables are high. And recently we had a meeting with representatives from the wastewater treatment authority. They formed their own separate authority away from the power of the city. And I wonder sometimes if that's intentional. And when we met with them, they were very arrogant in saying, we're going to choose the cheapest option to treat wastewater for those families. The cheapest option is not the best option. And one of the things that I had to point out to them is that it was that kind of thinking that led to Flint and the crisis that happened there over lead. And that type of thinking exists across this country when it comes to who gets access to infrastructure and who doesn't. And it's very important that we're having this discussion right now, because right now on Capitol Hill, they're debating an infrastructure bill. And we all need to look at it and see, and look at it through the lens of health, and see how is it going to impact the public health. Even if it means, for an example, they were talking about building more roads or repairing roads, or these roads that are going through communities of color that's already divided and dealing with pollution because of the traffic that goes back and forth. Are we talking about wastewater treatment facilities that actually work, that will be placed in these communities? Or are they going to put the cheapest systems like the lagoons that they're putting, lagoons that my friends in Lagos are telling me that they have that are failing there as well? Or they're going to put sewage lagoons in communities next to neighborhoods. In one case in Whitehall, Alabama, which is along the Selma to Montgomery March Trail, they're also looking at putting a sewage lagoon there next to an elementary school. Now, knowing what we know about Hookworm, who could in their right mind would want to put a sewage lagoon next to an elementary school? That's why it is important for us to be having these discussions, because these systemic structures that are baked into our system and creating the kinds of inequities that continue to exist and to persist through healthcare disparities will continue to happen if we don't call them out and call for a change. So I would really like to have a conversation around that and how we can find solutions to these problems. And I think this is the time for us to move back into talking specifically about the book, but thank you for allowing me to not only to vent a little bit, but also to put some things on your mind about where do we go from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Flowers. That was great. You said so many interesting things in that. I'm not sure where to take off, but I'll start with, what am I going to start with? I'm going to start with Hurricane Ida, because we were chatting last week a little bit right after Hurricane Ida struck, I think. And it was interesting because after that, I was looking kind of closely at the news coverage, and I saw a lot of coverage of drinking water and electricity that had to do with air conditioning and roads being out, but nothing or very, very little about wastewater. And it is obviously a huge problem and was a huge problem after that. But can you talk a little bit about that, about why it continues to not be on people's radar with these, these big events and with the infrastructure bill. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I think that the reason why it's not on people's radar is because most of the people that are doing the reporting aren't living in these communities. So oftentimes I have to break it down and explain to people what straight piping is because they don't know. And the first thing they want to say is, so what is wrong? Why they can't connect to a municipal system? And we're talking about rural communities. So a lot of the framing around these issues, people look at it from their own experiences. And a lot of the people that are in a position to report about these issues don't really know these issues. And part of what I have to do oftentimes when people come to Lowndes County is that I have to educate them first so they can know what they're looking at when they go and look at it, because sometimes they'll go and write and ask some questions that even the local people are looking at them like, you don't know about this? So I think that's the reason why. And I think the other part of it is who's impacted. Another reason why there's no reporting on it. And I think that the final reason is that people want to assume that this is not a problem in the US. And that's one reason why I wrote the book.
It's interesting. In the book, I noted that there's a number of times when you're bringing people to Lowndes County and showing them around and giving them the tour. And in every instance, people seem shocked, right, by what they're seeing. And then do you continue to be surprised that people are surprised? Do you know what I mean? Or I don't know. Because I was like,
yes, because I still talk to people now that tell me, oh, I didn't know there was a wastewater problem in this country. So I think that people are in more bubbles than we realize. I think COVID has proven that. So a lot of people are isolated. I don't know where they're getting their information from. People, if they visit areas where they want to go, where they want to go. And a lot of them are not off the beaten path. And usually when they're on a destination from one place to the other, they don't look around them to see what's going on in the surrounding communities. If they go to a resort, they don't generally ask questions. Every time I travel now, if they send a driver to pick me up, I'm asking them about the local area. I'm asking about wastewater issues, and they're sharing this to me. And it's a bigger problem than people realize. But most people are not asking those questions. If they ask the questions, they would get the answers. And I think part of the shock comes because folk don't want to believe it. That they really believe that this is somewhere else, that they're being malevolent when they're sending the money off to help somebody else, because they expect it to happen there. And which is wrong. It shouldn't happen there either. But the arrogance of us being in the wealthiest country in the world and for it to exist here shows that we have some deep structural problems that we have to uncover. And that is where the shock comes from. I believe that people, when they see it for themselves, they cannot ignore that anymore.
I was really struck in your book too about how you got so much support from conservatives, and there's so much, reaching across the aisle, although you weren't doing it in a political way necessarily. And I was wondering, and I think the book was written like maybe a year and a half ago or something, or 2 years ago, and I was wondering if some of that has changed, or how do you see that now? Do you
Well, I see it two ways. First of all, being in the South, the South is a very complex place. So, there's one conversation that you can have with a person by themselves, and there's a different one you have when they're with a group.
Mm.
So a lot of people now, I see a lot more people being influenced by the group mentality. But this is an issue that they cannot afford to ignore on either side of the aisle, because most of the people that are on, especially in these red states, are supported by people from rural communities that have these problems. So ultimately, they're going to have to find a way to deal with it, because otherwise their supporters who are moving out of these rural communities because of these kinds of problems are getting less and less. And I think that in terms of my work, it was just the timing when I started doing the work, when I started working with Bob Woodson. We agreed that this is an issue that should be addressed. And what people don't know about Bob Woodson, although he's a political conservative, his best friend is a yellow dog Democrat. I mean, people just assume that if you have different political beliefs that you can't talk to each other.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the things that we do try to do. We have to do it here. Otherwise, I wouldn't have any friends or neighbors.
Do you find that you talk a lot in the book about faith, about your faith, and do you find that gives you common ground with people, or do you use that? I don't want to say like you use it, but does that help you have common ground with people?
I think it does provide common ground. I think with any, when we meet people, we have to find something that we have in common, whether the fact that we have children, I always mention that I'm a grandparent, whether, we like gardening, whether you're vegetarian or not, whether you like fishing. I think all of these things, but my faith in the South, I think has helped me, not only has helped me meet people and develop friendships and relationships, but it also helped me to be encouraged when times have been hard.
Mm-hmm.
And when it has not resonated, and it has helped me to not give up. And I try to look for those things about faith, whether it is, whether I meet my Muslim brothers and sisters, or whether I'm talking to my Jewish brothers and sisters, or my Christian brothers and sisters, or my indigenous brothers and sisters. I meet people where they are, and I respect and honor their faith. And that is a part of, I think it's a bonding experience to do that. And they respect and honor mine in return.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really moving in the book when you speak of it. How did you decide? You mentioned a little bit of this in your talk, but what moved you to finally to write the book? And were you sort of, because there's a lot of you and it's very personal. And were you nervous to put so much of yourself into a book and put that out there?
I had to, because I wanted people to understand that you don't have to be famous to make a difference. And oftentimes, and I wrote it for my daughter and my grandson as well. And I spent a lot of time working with young people. And sometimes people just need to have other experiences to see that it's okay to fail sometimes. You just have to get back up. And it's also, and it's okay to switch gears sometimes. I mean, we have people believing that they're supposed to, to enter into these situations and walk a straight line. And sometimes it's just never a straight line. And that's the way it was for me.
Was there one point when you say that, is there one point in particular that you're thinking of a sort of zigzag that you took that ended up being really productive? Or
I started out wanting to be a lawyer. and here I am. I never knew that I would be doing what I'm doing.
Well, there's a lot of legal in what you do, right? So there's a lot of that in there still.
Yeah,
right?
a lot of that still, yes. But I think that a lot of it is, but the activist part became innate, and everywhere I went, it seems like it kind of emerged. And that part of that, comes out in the story, whether I'm teaching and I'm filing complaints on behalf of students, or whether I'm, in a military wife and I have to fight for my spouse who was injured and they didn't want to do right by him. So It's all of that.
Do you want to talk a little bit about some solutions? Because a lot of the problems you talk about seem pretty daunting, right? Climate change and structural racism and how they're combining and sort of spiraling up. And do you have any suggestions for what should we think about doing to help fix this?
I think there are numerous things that can be done. I mean, there are some people that are writing letters. I know some people that are doing the tweet storm tomorrow to encourage the passage of the infrastructure bill. I know people that are going to COP26. I know people that are going to, there's a, Ted is doing a countdown to COP. I'm going to that. There are all kinds of ways in which I think we can be actively engaged, whether it's writing letters, making phone calls, going to protests, joining organizations, working in a community that's in need, sending supplies to people that are dealing with disasters. So there are any number of ways in which people can be involved. Working or interning with organizations like CREES, or finding a community organization that might need your skill set that can't afford to pay someone to do it, and volunteering. Running for office.
Running for, is that your next step? Are you running for office?
No.
You want to declare here? This is a good place to do it.
I'm going to support good candidates.
Great. All right, we have a lot of questions coming in, so let me look at some of the questions in the audience. The first is from Mohammed Zaman, and he asks, in certain places like my native Pakistan, in urban informal settlements where there are stateless refugees and vulnerable communities, we're seeing a convergence of poor sanitation and climate change, which you've talked about a little bit. What's your advice to students and scholars who are interested in addressing this issue of inequity and injustice?
I think the first thing is that we have to let people know about it, and writing books and reports about it, I think would be very good. And also collecting the data, because a lot of the data is not available. I know that even here in the US, there's no central database on wastewater in this country. Like where there are failures, where people don't have, we don't know the numbers. People have asked me, how many people don't have wastewater treatment? We don't know, because we have not been collecting that information. So I think that could happen globally. And I think if we know if that's a problem here, it's a problem in other parts of the world as well. And that's a way to document it and make it known and write about it.
That's so interesting. That sounds like a master's project for somebody to get started on. So that's great. This is a really interesting question. Coming out of the Black radical, it's from Naomi Gross. Coming out of the Black radical organizing tradition and having organized for a number of decades yourself, how have organizing tactics such as marches changed in effectiveness over the years? And have you shifted your tactics over time?
Well, I march when I march when marching was effective, but sometimes marching is not effective. So the work that I'm doing now, I think that there are different types of activism. And I've decided that I was going to focus on policy and work to try to change the policy, because when the policy doesn't change, we still have the same problems over and over again. Whether it's about mass incarceration, whether it's about voting, et cetera. We have to find ways to change policy. And I think what has happened, as we can see right now, people are reversing policy, whether we're talking about women's rights or women's right to make her own health choices. A lot of those battles we thought we had fought, we're still doing it now. And I think the way we have to remain vigilant and stay engaged on many, many levels. And I have chosen policy. There are other people that may think marching works. I think last year, all the marches that took place around the country for Black Lives Matter, that was timely, and it should have happened when it happened. And there will be other times to march. I think we have to march for voting rights. But I also think that we got to register people to vote, and we got to do other things as well, like making sure that we pass bills that ensure that all Americans have access to the ballot.
It's interesting. This is now me asking a question, but you talk a little bit in your book about just because I'm a science writer, and science and technology. And in this particular issue of wastewater, do you see anything, in septic, did you see anything coming over the horizon from I don't know, better systems or something that might help solve this problem? You know, does engineers have a role in this, maybe?
I know, I think that engineers do have a role in this. I think engineers have a role in promoting, first of all, telling the truth about failing systems. I think sometimes people are a little bit, they are afraid to acknowledge that something is not working, but we have to find real solutions. And now, and I'm framing it as climate solutions, because climate change is a factor now in all of this. And where these systems were not built to deal with these deluges of rain and all these floods and whatever, we have to build something else that's going to work. And what we're doing, we're not waiting on anyone else. We've decided that we're actually relocating to North Alabama, which is the home of the Space Command and also home of NASA's one of its space centers there. And we're going to partner, we're going to bring local philosophers and local folk that, you know, you got those people that can build anything, that never went to school, or not engineers, and they're dealing with wastewater issues, and they're trying to figure out how to keep it away from their homes. We want to bring them together with aerospace engineers to find technology that works. Because one of the things that we have found is that they treat wastewater as drinking water quality in outer space. Why haven't we looked at that before? You know, because, and then probably the reason we haven't looked at it is the same reason that we don't acknowledge that we have a problem. But now that we've acknowledged that we have a problem and more people are having problems, I think that we can find those solutions. And there are other people that are looking at other ways in which we can look at it as resource or as recovering resources, because a lot of water is used to deal with what we put in the toilet, you know, and water is becoming scarce. There are some communities, they turn on the faucet and no water is coming out. So there's a relationship there to water and wastewater. And if we can find a way to recover and reuse, I think that we will be on our way to solving some of the planetary issues that we have around that and water scarcity.
That'd be great. That would sound like a win-win. And you also said in your book, I think, that you wanted to be an astronaut at one point. So this is, you get to do some of that too, right?
Yeah, you know, kind of takes me full circle. I mean, I've always been interested in space and astronomy, and yeah, it will give me a chance to kind of, you know, dip my toe in the water, so to speak.
Yes. All right, here's another question from Colleen Pike Blair that says, your book is an exemplary guide for addressing public health disparities through collaboration and advocacy and integrating the priorities of individuals and communities living with longstanding inequities. A recently published article in the New York Times told the story of failing wastewater systems in rural public schools in Mississippi, the impact on education outcomes for the children. Do you have any experience working on these issues with the public school system in Alabama?
No, I don't. What I am fighting against in Alabama is are the lagoons that they're putting in near these schools, like the lagoon that they want to put near the elementary school in Whitehall, Alabama. And I grew up, the high school that I went to, there was a sewage lagoon right at the bottom of the hill. We could smell it on a, you know, if it was a very hot day. That was, you know, I went to this high school from 9th through 12th grade. And smell raw sewage. I thought that was normal for people to have sewage lagoons there. Wow. So I think that as we explore this particular subject more and learn more about it, we're going to find that it's more common in places that we did not realize. It does not surprise me of that being in Mississippi, because people are straight piping in Mississippi, they're straight piping in Louisiana, they're straight piping in California. So the question is, what other large institutions are also dealing with these issues of inadequate wastewater treatment, and how do we address it?
Right. Okay. Question from Dylan Keating, student, staff. Your story is very inspiring for young activists. Very true. I imagine there's a lot of moments where it's easy to feel overwhelmed by your activist role. And how have you maintained hope throughout all the change you've advocated for?
I hear that question every time. And it's a good question. My faith, I keep my Bible turned to the 91st Psalm. There's sometimes I just stop for myself. You know, people don't I do strange stuff sometimes. Sometimes I can't listen to the news. So one of the ways I relax, I watch Nigerian movies on Netflix. So it really helps me to understand American politics. But I do that. I like music. I like dance. I watch TikTok. And sometimes, you know, when I get brave enough, I'm going to do a challenge on TikTok. But I try to do things that are mindless so I can recover and recuperate. And there are also people that I go and talk to when I need encouragement.
Nigerian movies in Nigerian?
Yeah, they're actually, you know,
English?
because, you know, a lot of Nigerians speak English. So,
Yeah.
but I get a chance to hear sometimes I look at the movies with subtitles. I even watch Indian movies, East Indian movies. I watched one movie recently, the name of it was Toilet. And it helped me to understand. Of course, I would be the one to watch the movie named Toilet, but I thought that it was very good because it helped me to understand some of the cultural barriers to some communities adopting toilets. So it was, I learned a lot, and that's one of the places that I like to visit when we're able to travel, hopefully again, safely.
That is so interesting. All right, a question from a BU public health student. This is similar to the last one. How do you keep from getting discouraged from the lack of attention these issues continue to receive? And are there any specific wins since the book has come out that reinvigorated you?
Yes, I've gotten a chance to testify before 4 House committees on sanitation specifically, and I'm generally the only one talking about sanitation. I've also testified before a Senate subcommittee on dealing with sanitation as it relates to climate change and the need for us to do the type of research to deal with it, and also to make it available to communities that don't have it. I've developed relationships with organizations like NRDC, and we're now talking about wastewater and sanitation, which was not something that was on their radar before. The same thing with the Climate Reality Project. Those are wins. So that's how I get encouragement. I just get encouragement because every time I go somewhere and meet, I'm sure even out of this conversation, somebody's going to reach out to me and they're going to provide some either assistance or we're going to do some collaboration. So that's a win. And the fact that people think that this is something that we should be dealing with. And those are wins as well. And they give me encouragement. So every time I meet a new person who's interested, who wants to get engaged, involved, or somebody revealing something happening in their community, or even, I know you're gonna ask me a question about this, but even relationships like with the Guardian, those are all wins, and that keeps me encouraged.
Since you brought it up, can you tell a little bit about what you're doing with the Guardian? What's that about?
Yeah, the relationship with the Guardian actually started when I was, it started because when we broke our parasite study, we allowed the Guardian to break that story because we felt like no American paper would want to deal with it, you know. So, because at that time, up to that point, we weren't getting a lot of people talking about wastewater issues, and that's how we first met them. And then later, and they held the story for 3 years because we had to have the study peer reviewed. And then after that, when Dr. Philip Alston, who was the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty, came to the US on his official visit, they were embedded in his entourage. And we again took them to some places where they saw raw sewage because Dr. Alston did not initially see the connection between the sewage issue and poverty. So that was, that changed it for him in terms of his trip. And it became kind of a highlight of his presentation that he made in Geneva. And I was there, and the Guardian did a forum in Geneva, which I was a part of, where we talked about poverty in America. And later they reached out to me because I've been talking about this wastewater problem for quite some time. They profiled my book and they reached out to me and said, you know, why don't we do a series of stories on wastewater issues? Because you're saying that there are wastewater issues across the US. And I said, they are, and nobody's reporting on them. So they got funding to do that, got support from an NGO, and we have partnered on that, and we've done a number of stories. And the first story that they did was on Centerville in Illinois, which I write about in the book. And then they did a story on, then after that, I got the outreach from Mount Vernon. They did the story on Mount Vernon. And they've done a story since then. People are reaching out from around the country. People from the Hamptons reached out because their wastewater systems are failing. Same issue. I mean, the way they described it, I didn't even know that they claim that they have the most densely populated area with on-site septic systems in the U.S. I don't know whether that's true or not, but they're failing. And then, of course, the most recent story was on a place in Virginia where these are Black people that mine the ocean for oysters, and it's been their area is being polluted with raw sewage. So this particular partnership is allowing us to see what we already knew, or allowing other people to see how widespread this problem is around the U.S.
That's interesting. I was wondering if that's why you went to Mount Vernon, so that makes sense. Here's a question from Carol Bois. I'm not sure if I pronounced that right. It says, this is like two parts. So the first is, in general, it seems like people in cities are unaware of all the infrastructure that exists to help them until it fails, and are especially unaware of unequal distribution of such systems. So I want to ask you a question about that, because you also talk a lot about rural bias or urban bias against rural communities. And since you're here talking to a very urban public health school, are there things that you want us to know, want these public health students to know?
Well, first of all, I think that there's something I call the rural lexicon that we should understand. And the rural lexicon means that all places are not towns. And even when policy is written for, most policy is written that you can't even get access to the funding unless you're a town or an incorporated area.
Interesting.
Most of the US is unincorporated. Most people live in cities. Because when we talk about the US proper, we're talking about the land mass that makes up the United States of America. And that land mass is very rural, very rural. But when you see people in these urban areas, it's lots of people clustered into one area. But throughout those areas, there are people living there. And for some reason, when we make policy, we feel that the only people that should get access to those services are people that are living in the larger cities. And when we look at rural communities, a lot of things, I mean, there's some people that come to a rural area and they look for a Starbucks, you're not going to find it, you know. Or somebody asked me one time, where can I go and get a latte? And you're not going to get it here. You're more likely to get a cup of sweet tea. So, you know, I think a lot of times we look at it with an urban lens, and there is also a rural lens or a small town lens that people should be conscious of, because people in small towns, everybody know each other. You have to be careful when you go into a small town and talking, because you could be talking to somebody that's two first cousins once removed. So it's not the same as being in a city. And doctors, a doctor in a small town setting or rural area is probably a very popular person, versus in a city where you're just one of so many. So I think that we have to, and then if you do something in a rural community, expect everybody to know about it, and you don't have, it won't be on television, but everybody will still know about it. So I think that there are differences, different nuances, and what I try to do when we talk about rural communities, I ask students to go and spend time in rural communities, not just drive through there. Because I remember one person I was talking to about this, he said a lot of young people only think a rural place is a place that you go through to get to the mountains or to the beach. But there's life there, and there's community and culture, and learning about that will help us solve a lot of problems. Because I think as we see people moving out of some of these areas, or people are moving out of, they're moving out of these areas because they are being neglected. They don't have health care, they don't have decent jobs, they don't have enough housing, they don't have sustainable infrastructure there. But I believe that there's going to be a shift, because as climate change becomes more of a reality, as we saw with COVID, people moved out of the cities. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think that's going to happen again.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There's another part to Carol's question, and you did answer some of this, but just in case there's anything else you want to add. The way we use water to get rid of our waste is antiquated. Sorry if you addressed this already, but what about novel ways for wastewater, such as composting, that use composting toilets that use less water and generate a better outcome, compost. There seems to be a lot of resistance to these new ideas. Any thoughts on
I
that?
think there are resistance to new ideas. Compost is not a new idea. You know, we did composting when I was growing up. You know, we put everything was reused. This is new to the people that are doing it now. But we were doing it before. And I remember when we brought some people to Lowndes County to talk about composting toilets, they said, that's not too far from when we were using slop jars. We want something different. And I think we have to respect that, because if people do not, if you come up with a solution that only you accept and the masses don't accept it, it's like vaccines, it won't get done.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the part of finding solutions is having the people sit at the table that they have to buy them too. I think we have to change that. We got to stop having top-down approaches.
Mm-hmm.
And we got to also have community engagement as part of making these solutions and finding designs that will work and that people will in fact use and pay for. So, because if not, if you develop something that people are not going to use, we just wasted time. So we looked at composting toilets where people don't want compost. I remember we would get all the food that we got went into what we called a slop jar. And a slop bucket. Slop jar was used for something else. But the slop bucket was used to feed the hogs. And the hogs were used to feed the family. So, I mean, a lot of the reuse, my mother reused, I think I may have written about this. My mother reused aluminum foil so many times, we thought it couldn't, that it had a lifespan that would outlast us. The jelly jar became the water glasses. So a lot of what people are doing now, we did it out of necessity. We didn't do it because it was new age or whatever people would call it today. We did it out of necessity, but I think that now we have to keep in mind that a lot of the new technologies do not take into account climate change. And one of the things that I'm pushing for is that any federal dollars that are used to buy any new wastewater treatment technology should come with, each of these technologies should come with a warranty, a service and a parts warranty. People don't know this, but if you buy an on-site system, I know in Alabama, it may be true in other areas too. If you buy an on-site system, it does not come with a warranty. The liability, once it goes in the ground, the liability is transferred to the homeowner. What happens if it fails? It shouldn't be somebody else's responsibility. They were proposing a minimum of like $15,000 per family for a household that didn't have on-site wastewater treatment. And I had meetings with people that represent the manufacturers, and they did not want a warranty. I said, wow, this is crazy. If I pay $15,000 for a car, I expect a warranty. If I buy a hot water heater, I expect a warranty, a service and a parts warranty. So what is it about your systems that you think you shouldn't have a warranty? If you can't stand behind it, why should I buy it?
And what do they say?
They couldn't say anything.
Yeah, they couldn't say anything. That's amazing. That is shocking, right? Yeah.
And that's part of the problem. So I feel like these new technologies, if people want people in Lowndes County to use them in their homes first.
Good answer. So there's a couple questions about the infrastructure bill and the Green New Deal. And I was wondering if you've been, because I'll be honest, I haven't been following it that closely, but looking at the back and forth of the infrastructure bill, do you feel like that or the Green New Deal is addressing some of these points that you're bringing up, or any of these points? And how?
Some of it, but I can't, I'm still waiting to see what's being introduced today. I've actually talked with someone yesterday about what is going to be debated, what's coming out of the House today, and whether or not there's going to be anything there for wastewater. I know that in the compromise bill, there's money for removing lead service lines, but I'm still looking to see, is there anything dealing with wastewater? That's why I keep talking about it. I'm going to keep jumping up and down until something gets done. In terms of the Green New Deal, I think that if we look at wastewater treatment, especially when you talk about on-site systems, they can't be, you got to have an electric source. So let's see how, solar panels may be used with that, solar energy. What other energy sources can we use to run them, or can they be energy sources themselves? I mean, those are things that we have to talk about. One of my friends that you're going to mention a little bit later, that's one of the things that he was doing, was taking effluent and turn it into biofuel. So we have to look at the various possibilities. My concern with, and this is not about wastewater specifically, but as I talk about the transition to a clean energy economy, we have to make sure that people have a working, that people make a living wage, so that they can afford to buy the cars that will, because we don't want to gentrify clean energy too, that the people that can afford it gets and the people that can't are left behind. So we have to make sure that that does not happen. And I am keeping an eye to that. And when I do talk, I talk about that as well too, the people that will listen that can make a difference.
There's a couple practical questions in there from students about, are there, for students who really want to get engaged with this, are there internships or places where they should volunteer, or places you recommend them looking?
Well, I know with us, there are internships. I know that people from and if you can't find internships on your own, feel free to reach out to us. I can connect you to some of the other organizations that we're involved in. If we're not a good fit, there's there's the Climate Reality Project, of course. I'm on their board. There's the Center for Constitutional Rights. There's Partners in Health. There is the Equal Justice Initiative. All the groups that I'm associated with are looking for interns. So if there's an opportunity or you're interested in opportunities, people are always sending me stuff looking for interns or looking for people to work for them. So I'm willing to share that information. If you have a specific interest, I am accessible through social media.
Great, that's so nice of you. Thank you. We have time for a couple more questions. There's one from Lucy Mize. I believe in health and all policies, but somehow the moral good around health seems to be failing us in the US. I mean, people aren't that interested in that, the moral good. Do you think economic arguments around wastewater and sewage would resonate more with governments and ultimately provide communities with better outcomes?
Well, I think that the economic arguments around slavery is what made slavery manifest and last so long. I think we have to stick, I'd rather stick with the moral argument.
Good for you. Along those lines, from anonymous question, what do you say to people who think equity isn't fair? Or how do you present your argument? And I guess maybe another way to ask that question is the sort of blaming the victim. Like, how do you answer people who say, well, these people with, failing septic tanks, they're doing something illegal and it's their fault. How do you answer that?
I don't even respond to that.
Take that, people.
When people, I've just learned, when I was teaching, one of the ways in which I was able to modify the behavior of my students is not respond to negative behavior, because some people just want attention and I don't give it to them. I rather put my time and effort into finding solutions. So I know that to blame the victim is to take me off of what I'm supposed to be focusing on, and I just don't do that. And when people talk about the lack of equity, I just tell them that what they need to do is come in and walk in my shoes, be Black for a week, and see whether they continue to be Black for the rest of their lives, or they believe that everything is equal.
It's a very powerful answer. There was one other one. This is an anonymous question. Is there one thing you would have changed in your journey so far, or something that you would have done differently?
Maybe I would have gone to Milton Academy. But if that would have happened, I may not have come back to Alabama. I don't know. But but no, I just feel like, all the things that I went through, I'm starting to realize that at my age, I'm over 60. And all the things
Really?
yeah.
You look so young.
Well,
whatever
thank
you're
you.
doing, whatever you're doing, you're doing the right thing.
Drinking a lot of water and getting a lot of encouragement from young people. But I think that I wouldn't change anything because I wouldn't be who I am today. I wouldn't have these stories to write. I wouldn't know how to talk to people the way I do. I wouldn't have had, because I've had the experience of being in rural communities and growing up poor, and then being around people that are far more affluent than I could ever even imagine. I've taken billionaires to Lowndes County. And I just feel like, and one of my friends made an announcement today that they started an organization called Galvanize, an investment firm that's going to focus on climate solution. That's Tom Steyer. So just, I wouldn't change, I wouldn't take anything for this journey, because I wouldn't be who I am today had it not been for the hard knocks and all the things. And that's all of our journeys. It's never going to be perfect. That's not life. But at the end of it, we end up being more polished. We end up being a better person when we learn from our mistakes. And I think that we have to understand that what we have to do is get up and dust ourselves off and keep on going. Because at the end of this journey may be a completely different person that started out on that journey. And it's okay.
That's wonderful. I think that's a perfect place to end. Thank you so much for that inspiring ending. And thank you so much for taking this time to talk to us. We're going to turn it back over to Dean Cozier to wrap it up.
Thank you so much for your words. One of your last responses, I'm still resonating with that one, about equity. But I do want to thank you for joining us today and for gracing us with your words. And thank you so much for the book. And I'd like to thank the audience for joining us and for being so engaging and being part of this thoughtful conversation. Thank you, Barbara, for your masterful moderation of this conversation. And I just would like to ask people to keep on their radar that our next public health conversation will actually be tomorrow. And it is entitled 9/11, 20 years later. It's at 10 in the morning, and more details can be found on our SPH website and on the calendar. So with that, I again want to thank everyone for tuning in. Don't stop talking about this. The conversation is just beginning. Let's continue to pay attention to what's happening politically and in our communities, and promoting public health.